And we're going to turn at this point as we prepare to welcome our next teacher of Torah. And as we move from Berlin over to the UK. And so it is my pleasure to welcome Rabbi Jonathan Wittenberg. Rabbi Wittenberg serves as the rabbi of the New North London Synagogue. That one's a little easier to say than the one in Berlin. And he is also the senior rabbi of Masorti Judaism in the UK. And as we are really embracing here this idea of one movement and 24 hours and lots of Torah, it's such a joy to be able to include and really work with our Masorti movement, Masorti Olami, Masorti in Israel, and to be able to welcome Rabbi Wittenberg to share his Torah with us now. So welcome.
Thank you, Rabbi Gaba, and it's very moving to me to follow on from Rabbi Gezer Ederberg because my family came, both my parents were refugees from Germany. My mother's father studied in Berlin at the Hochschule für die Wissenschaft des Judentums in the Artilleriestraße, and my great-grandfather on my father's side taught at the Orthodox Hildesheimer Seminar in the same street. So both sides of my family come from that culture of German Jewry, both Orthodox and liberal, and so to follow on for me is a great privilege. I've taken two Hasidic texts, and I'm hoping people can see them. And I think I want to do them in the following order. The text of Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Leib of Ger, I'd like to do first. And should there be time, I'd like to come to the second text. And I want to say before everything that as we all know and feel heavy on our heart, these are very difficult times for the whole of the Jewish people, for Israel, also for the civilians and citizens in Gaza. And I pray for better times. I pray for an end to the loss of life. I pray for a pathway which will bring everybody some hope and something to live for. And one of the reasons why I love the Torah which follows is it's so profoundly universal, that the sense of I am the Lord your God, which this first Hasidic piece addresses, is to every human being, to all flesh and blood. And it follows on from the founding idea of what a human being is, that every one of us is uniquely created in the image of God, and therefore every one of us is a trustee of each other's life. So Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Leib of Ger lived into the 20th century. He died in 1905. Ger is effectively a suburb just outside Warsaw. I understand from Polish friends in my community that unfortunately there's nothing much left of it except some sort of memorial. He was so popular that they had to extend the railway line to take the huge numbers of Hasidim who would go to hear his lectures to the Beit Midrash where he taught. And he himself recorded his teachings in kind of lecture notes when Shabbat or Yom Tov was out, which make them a little cryptic, because occasionally he would say things like, I don't remember how this went on, or he would put ... and hope that the reader would know how to continue the quotation. So I've done my best, and people may be familiar with Art Green's excellent The Language of Truth, which is a translation of selections from that Sefat Emet, indeed the language of truth. And this one begins, as he often does, he builds on Agadah, on earlier homily. And it's a famous homily in the Talmud based on the words of the Torah when it describes the children at Sinai of standing betachtit hahar. Now, probably the plain translation is the lower slopes of the mountain. I'm a keen walker and love Scotland, and I have stood on the lower slopes of many mountains. But with classic rabbinic ingenuity and creativity, this is understood as underneath the mountain, the sort of thing you get in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And the passage in the Talmud, it's on 88, the Talmud Shabbat 88, I think A, is well known, that God hung the mountain over them like a barrel and said, if you accept my Torah, all well and good. And if you don't, sham tehei kevuratchem, that is where you are going to be buried. And funnily enough, they decided that it might be a good idea to accept the Torah. This is really rather radically different from this notion of a gift freely given and received with joy. But that's not how the Rebbe understands. Because a gigit, the suspended like a barrel, also has, I'll just make sure my coffee cup is finished. You could also put the barrel this way up so that the people are actually inside something special. And that's how he, and also some other Hasidic thinkers like Kalonimus Kalman Shapira after him, understand it. They're in some special kind of atmosphere, a unique environment. And that environment has something distinctive and profound about it and is available for us to try to re-enter. And so that's where I'm going to pick up the text. And I hope you have it. I've begun it by sort of precising the reference to the Talmud. And we're told still in the Talmud that this is a Moda'ah Rabbah, a great declaration concerning the Torah. This is an essential truth. V'yesh lomar. Now he picks up his words. I'm in the second line of the Hebrew, as I have it. I hope you have the same format. Ki b'shat matan Torah, in the time of the giving of Torah. I'm actually now in the fourth line of the Hebrew as you have it. I hope you've got good eyesight. It's like being at the optician's trying to read the last line. Oh, it's been there now. If all opticians were as good as Ilana, that would be amazing. Hayta Cherut. At the time of the giving of the Torah, there was complete freedom. Now we're going to have to define what we mean by freedom shortly, and he's going to take us there. So I'm just going to hold the word. K'moshe katvu chazal, as our sages said. Now our sages said it in the following way, that the writing that Moses took on the tablets was charut ala luchot, engraved in the stone. Al tikra charut, don't read engraved, but cherut, understand it as freedom. And that is rather a different rabbinic understanding from the one that the Rabbi will here pursue. That rabbinic understanding is the only true freedom is the service of God, as was expressed in the wonderful poem by Yehuda Halevi, Eved, Avdei Zaman Avdei Avadim Heim Eved Adonai Levad Chovshi. Those who serve the things of time are slaves of slaves. The servant of God alone is free. But he's going to have a unique understanding of it, and a beautiful understanding, and a challenging one. Va'perush shahaita mitgala pnimiyut hachiyut shel hateva gamken. The meaning is that the inner nature, the inner pnimiyut hachiyut, the very inner vitality of all nature revealed itself. All things became revealed. So we don't see, as it were, the revelation of the divine as a God above revealing that divine self from outside of all living being, but rather also as revealing the divine within all being as the essential nature of all things. This is an idea that we have in his writing and in the mystics and poets of so many cultures across the world. I'll take it a little bit further, but then I want to just go back to that point because it's so important. It's so central to my own personal religious life and striving to get to the point where I can just begin to get a glimpse of that oneness and sacred vitality that flows through all things. And all of nature was subservient to God alone, not to its own will or to its ego or to its nature or to the sitra achra, the other side, in inverted commas, as Kabbalah would understand, only to God. And thus shall it be, as it shall be in the future, when God shall be one and God's name shall be one. In other words, the oneness of the divine will be manifest in all things. And just to stick with this idea, because it so moves me, and just to find it in a couple of different places. It's being in Britain, I suppose it is my responsibility to bring a little bit of England to everybody. Let me take the poetry of Wordsworth from Tintern Abbey, a wonderful wooded site near the River Wye. And he says as follows: I have felt a joy, I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean, and the living air, and the blue sky, and in the mind of man, a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. It is that sense of the inner oneness that is the true nature of everything. And just using my own words a bit here, Everything then, each individual person, each culture, nature too, the animals, the trees, are different manifestations of the one that flows through all things. And all life is distinct, unique, separate, and precious by virtue of its uniqueness, and yet united and one. And in that moment of the giving Torah, when this unique atmosphere is put over the whole of creation, then that oneness is manifest, and the differences that create so much challenge and make us blind to what unites us have temporarily vanished. And in a remarkable letter that the Sfat Emet Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh of Ger, the author of the piece I'm teaching and talking about, writes to his children and grandchildren, he writes the following: the oneness we declare each day in saying, "Hear, O Israel," needs to be understood as it truly is. What's entirely clear to me, I shall reveal to you. The meaning of God is one is not that he's the only God, though that's true. The content is as follows: everything that exists in the world, spiritual and physical, is God. It is only because of the contraction that was God's will, blessed be God, that holiness descended rung after rung until actual physical things were formed out of it. And then he says this is the truth at the heart of all mystical formulations in the world. And he says, even though it can be treated at great length, we need not go on about it now. Few words suffice. So that's how he understands that moment of Matan Torah. Rabbi Garber, can I return to the text, please? If that's okay. No, I'll just take it forward. I'm just checking the time. I don't want to overrun. So to come back to the text, that's a good formulation, and I can use my cursor on it, and I'll pick it up here. I'll leave out the square brackets, and we're in the 5th line of the Hebrew. Kamoshe Katuv, as it's written, Vayered Adonai al Har Sinai. God descended upon Har Sinai, but we translate it, and this is the Onkelos translation, Va'itgen. The divine is revealed. Now he leaves the geographical limitation of Mount Sinai behind now for a moment and says, because there was a revelation of the vitality in all creation, in all created being. And thus also is it written, you are revealed. Now those are the opening words of the Musaf prayer on Rosh Hashanah, the section which is known as the Shofarot, which focuses on the theme of the shofar, which heralds at Sinai and ever since revelation. You are revealed everywhere. V'chein katuv, and thus also is it written, panim b'panim diber Adonai. Face to face did God speak. And as so often in Hasidic exegesis, you can describe this as cheating, or you can describe this as a wonderfully creative misreading, or you can also describe it as the mystical that transcends the text. Because the verse goes on to say, God spoke to you, and it's also face to face alone that God speaks to Moses. But here it's extended to the whole of creation. Shaita kol habriya mikuvan lamala. Because all creation was directed or focused upwards, the shoresh hachiyut, to the root of the vitality, of its vitality. So it all heard God saying, I am. And it all responded by finding that presence of God within itself and looked upwards to the source of its vitality. There's perhaps, if one's sticking with nature here, the image of the uninverted tree. The roots are above and the manifestation below, but the vitality of everything is connected through that sap flow, that sacred emanation of divine energy that penetrates all things everywhere. The shoresh hachiyut, ve'ita, and we find Kishe'amar Hashem yitbarach anochi Adonai Elohecha. When the Lord God, blessed be God, said, I am the Lord your God. And we're pausing there. We're deliberately not going on with the rest of the sentence yet. Hayu kol pratei hanivraim sfurim shelahem hadibur. All parts of creation, every created thing, reckoned, thought that these words were directed to them. They are absolutely universal. It's a singular you. The you in your God is singular, and everything recognizes that's me. That's me. This wonderful vision of all the animals and everything kind of radiant and silent and quiet and just transfixed for a moment in the understanding that my life is part of God's life. Now that's the universal, and we're going to return to that in a moment, but there's also a particular here. Ad she'amar asher, this should be hotzeiticha, and who brought you out? See there, ayin sham. And that moment, it becomes particular to the role and destiny of the Jewish people in making that oneness of God known in the world. For sure, the blessed God is the vitality and the energy, the strength of all created things. That's universal. And in truth, Adonai Elohecha kai al kol habriah, the Lord your God applies to all creation. Like only sheitgalut malchuto ve'elohuto lechol habriah hu al yedei Israel. Only revelation of God's sovereignty and divinity to all creation is by means of or through the agency of Israel. So it becomes our role and destiny to make evident that presence of God, to testify to it by the way we live and teach to the rest of, to all of creation. Interesting, he doesn't say to all humanity, he says to all creation. And in days of climate emergency, there's something there about our responsibility in God's name to nature, as well as our fellow beings of all faiths. Now, sometimes I have to say, I love Hasidic teaching. It's been one of my great sources of nourishment through these difficult sort of everywhere across the world, 15 lockdown months. But I do sometimes struggle with its particularity. And the Sfat Emet is far from an exception. On the contrary, he emphasizes this, as it were, the unique destiny of Israel and the unique soul that Jews have. But there's also another way of looking at it, which is to take Israel, Yisrael, in its root meaning, Ki sarita im anashim ve'elohim v'tuchal. You have struggled with God and human beings and been able. In other words, anyone who struggles with God, I can read out of it if I want the particularity. Sometimes I don't want, but sometimes I do want to do that, and see it as universal. Whoever struggles with God then becomes responsible for seeking the presence of God and, as it were, unfolding its evidence in our fellow human beings by how we treat each other, and in all of nature by how we respond to nature. And that is the most profound trust, and it's quite of a responsibility for the entirety of a life. I'll go back to the text in a moment, but as a lover of poetry, I'll bring one more poem. Again, I feel a responsibility to England. So this is a Welsh poet. You would hate it if I said that. This is R.S. Thomas. He was a priest in much of the poorer parts of Wales, and he writes about that. He died actually in the same year as Yehuda Amichai, and he writes a lot about God. Here's a poem called Just Alive. It is alive. It is you, God. Looking out, I can see no death. The earth moves, the sea moves, the wind goes on its exuberant journey. Many creatures reflect you. The flowers, your color. The tides, the precision of your calculations. There is nothing too ample for you to overflow. Nothing so small that your workmanship is not revealed. I listen, and it is you speaking. I think it sort of articulates the meaning of Anochi Adonai Elohecha, I am the Lord your God. So beautiful, just so beautiful. I'll just go back to the text, if I may, Rabbi Garba. I realize I've got about 10 more minutes left, so I won't run over. If I can go back to the text, he now wants to look at the uniqueness of this moment. V'nachzor lidvarein, but let us return to our words. In other words, I think he's saying, I want to just for now set aside the particularity of Israel and stay with the universal. Shekivan shaita mitgala achiyut v'haya tikkun ha'ra'ui. Now, since the vitality of all things was revealed, there was tikkun ha'ra'ui. It's difficult to translate this. Everything was repaired. Everything kind of, I think it means it was temporarily in its state of perfection. It's not going to stay there. We'll see in a moment. It's not going to remain there, but it's just held in this moment of perfection. Umimele. And hence, tzarich liot shelo yuchal adam lachto. And in such a situation, it's just not possible for a person to sin. Ki hateva atzmo me'akev. Because nature itself prevents it. One's held, as it were, in this perfected world, within that barrel, if you like, of this special atmosphere, and there is no temptation. And that perhaps is what he means by chirut. There is complete freedom from the interference, the invasion of the Yetzer Hara and desire and complexity, all the things that make up our daily life constantly and make it so challenging. In this sort of special state at that moment of revelation, even nature prevented. Nobody, no human being could transgress the will, the mind, the awareness of their creator. And that's the real meaning of God held the mountain over them. Nature itself was, as it were, its processes, the physical and psychological processes to which life is delivered all the rest of the time, nit batel, they're put on pause, they're put on hold. And they saw that there was no other vitality other than the vitality of Torah. We should take Torah in its most profound and universal sense as the divine creative energy. God looked in the Torah and created the world. It is the blueprint with which all creation comes to exist, and only in that way can creation exist. There's this wonderful midrash in the Talmud which follows closely upon God holding the mountain over people's heads, and it turns on, this is in the Talmud, 88a or b, Tractate Shabbat, the extra hay. What extra hay? We're told in the first chapter of Genesis, the days of creation, it was day 5, day 4, day 5, and Yom HaShishi, the 6th day. Why the? What other 6th day is there? Well, there's the 6th of Sivan, the day of the giving of the Torah. That's the 6th day. God says to creation, if Israel accept my Torah, you will have existence, you will continue. If not, you won't, as it were. So Torah and the very existence of all creation are bound together because the one is the essence of the other. Lo, ki lo hayta az chiyut misitra achra, rak misitra dikdusha. There was no impact, there was no vitality in the sitra achra, the other side. There were no temptations. Only from the side of holiness was there energy. And that is what's meant by the Talmudic word moda'ah, proclamation. The Talmud understands it very differently, and I won't go there because it'll take time. Because people did not know that subsequently nature would once more become hidden. Now that's important, because what Revelation gives us is momentary. It's a glimpse of the world as it truly is in its essential nature. but it's not the way we interact with the world all the time. It's not what's going to be day in, day out. We lose sight of the truth of these things, and we see things from the outside, and they're different. And we lose track. We don't recognize the oneness that underlies and underpins and flows through all. And that's life as we know it. ואז נראה להם שכל הכל בחוש הרעות שאי אפשר לעשות מהשם יתברכי החיים. But in that momentary time, they could actually see b'chush hara'ut. It was palpably visible. It was clearly visible that you can't depart from God, the life of all living things, the core life of all living things. Now then, mitzvah lizkor yom asher amadat lifnei Adonai Elohecha. It is therefore a commandment to remember the day when you stood before the Lord your God. Az omed kol adam. If we can just go down a tiny bit, I can move that down. Or if that could be moved down for me. Because, and this is important, and it emerges in the writings of the Sfatim et Rabbi Yehuda Aryeh Leib of Ger in many occasions, that what happened back then, be it in Egypt, be it at Sinai, is both a one-time event, and it leaves its impact ever after on that date and that time, a kind of a reshimu, and an impact or an imprint, and it is capable of recapture. So by marking this day, we can get a sense of that moment of divine revelation. It is not gone forever. And by remembering that day, it is as if we again are there and the passage of time falls away, for it is as eternal as it is universal. For then everybody stood before God really. And he's emphasizing the second person singular. Yom asher amadata, the day when you, that's me and you, stood before the Lord your God, because every one of us stood there. And that's, I think, a little bit more than see you at Sinai, in the slightly casual way, very nice, but slightly casual way in which that gets used. It's saying, this is real. This exists. We can have a glimpse of it. And I believe we do occasionally get a glimpse of this. In some of the greatest moments of our lives, the mind falls silent, and there is a sense of a profound oneness that's not only all around us, but flows through us. And in the silence, in the silence of our own thoughts, we realize I'm not actually me. I'm part of something much bigger. I belong to the sacred flow of all life. I think I'll leave it there if that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. The imagery, once again, we've got this beautiful imagery and also this strong message of standing and listening and breathing and being present for that relationship with God. I'm already sensing some themes as we're coming to receive that Torah, and it's just really so very beautiful. So thank you. And can you just let us know again the poet that beautiful poem? Maybe if you'll just read it one last time, because I just need those words in my head. Those were so beautiful.
The first one was
the second one.
The second one.
Yeah.
So it's R.S. Thomas.
Yeah.
It's in his collection Later Poems, and the poem is called Alive. Shall I read it again? Just
one more time, I think. We have 1 minute. It's so beautiful.
Thank you. It is alive. It is you, God. Looking out, I can see no death. The earth moves. The sea moves. The wind goes on its exuberant journeys. Many creatures reflect you. The flowers, your color. The tides, the precision of your calculations. There is nothing too ample for you to overflow, nothing so small that your workmanship is not revealed. I listen, and it is you speaking.
Thank you. Thank you. Wow. I don't know if it's, the British accent or just beautiful poetry. But we know that it is almost Chag for you. I wish you a Chag Sameach. And thank you, Rabbi Wittenberg, for teaching us
including
today.
me. Thank you.
Absolutely.